In this competitive relationship, if you actually take away the constraints that made it possible to have this a period of optimism after the Abraham Accords, that basically to think that now Israel is going to be integrated into a U.S. managed regional structure in which now we're going to have cooperation and the region can move forward to other directions. That was a period of optimism that was born in certain conditions, which included at the time, of course, the presence of the axis of resistance and the pressure this axis made on the region. But once that is absent, it's not clear why this should be continued to be the case, and why shouldn't the region or the various countries in the region that are non-democratic not revert back to more competitive environment.
On June 22, 2025, the U.S. Air Force sent B-2 bombers to destroy Iran's nuclear sites. 5 days before that, on June 17th, observing the extent of Israel's military operations inside of Iran and its destruction of Iran's proxy network, Hussein Aboubakr Mansour published an essay in Mosaic with a counterintuitive argument. Israel's strikes on Iran would not lead to an Arab embrace of the Jewish state. You see, most observers assumed the opposite, that weakening Iran would accelerate normalization, that gratitude and commercial interests would drive the Gulf states closer to Jerusalem. Hussein argued instead that removing the Iranian threat would actually reduce the Saudi incentives to normalize relations with Israel. Well, 7 months later, earlier this week in fact, Hussein published a follow-up analysis that shows that he was exactly right. What actually happened has exceeded his earlier, more cautious predictions. Saudi Arabia hasn't just declined to normalize with Israel, it has launched an aggressive regional repositioning campaign, weaponizing anti-Zionism as a competitive instrument against the first Abraham Accord signatory, the United Arab Emirates. Welcome to the Tikvah podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Silver. Hussein's latest piece, published this week in the Abrahamic Metacritique Substack, offers a new way to grapple with the reality of two major changes that decisively shape regional dynamics. First, the dismantling of Iran's axis of resistance, and second, the changing nature of America's role in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Turkey, and Israel each conduct their foreign policy in order to optimize their particular national advantages, with neither a dominant common adversary, as Iran was, nor under the umbrella of American leadership. Under these circumstances, Hussein argues, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism will remain strategically useful and even grow in their political utility. All of this is our subject this week. If you enjoy this conversation, you can discover more big ideas and in-depth analysis on Judaism, Israel, America, and the West at tikvahideas.org. Subscribe to access our full library of podcasts, videos, and essays, and join a growing community focused on Jewish life and the glories of Western civilization. You can subscribe to the Tikvah podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. I hope you'll leave us a 5-star review to help us grow this community of ideas. I welcome your feedback on this or any of our other podcast episodes at podcast@tikvah.org. And of course, if you want to learn more about our work at Tikvah, you can visit our website, tikvah.org, and follow us on Facebook and X. This episode of the Tikvah podcast is generously sponsored by David Bradlow. If you're interested in sponsoring an episode of the Tikvah podcast, we invite you to join the Tikvah Ideas Circle. Visit tikvah.org/circle to learn more and join. Here now is my conversation with Hussein Aboubakr Mansour. Hussein Aboubakr Mansour, welcome back to the Tikvah podcast.
Thank you, John.
Hussein, in discussing the way that you understand the Middle East right now, I actually want to come back to the essay that you published earlier this week, but I'd like to start with an essay that you published in Mosaic back in June. Just to situate our viewers and listeners, this was after or in the midst of Israel's incursion into Iran, but right before Operation Midnight Hammer, the operation in which the U.S. Air Force neutralized Iran's nuclear facilities. Then you wrote in Mosaic I just want to quote you to yourself. Israel's dramatic strikes on Iran fundamentally alter the strategic calculus, but will not erase deeply entrenched patterns of Arab geopolitical behavior. Pragmatism, rivalry, and calculated regional maneuvering will define the coming era far more than idealistic hopes and ideological fantasies. Enduring regional dynamics, you concluded then, not wishful thinking, will chart the future. That was at a time, Hussein, when conventional wisdom might have led us to believe that we were really on the threshold of a rapprochement or some kind of arrangement between the Saudis and Israel. Your logic went in the other direction. Explain what you saw that other people didn't see back then.
Well, the key here is our assumption about the region itself. That is, that the region has some sort, or the players in the region wish to reach some sort of a regional integrated structure in which they can cooperate. It's a good assumption. It's not clear that this has to. Why is this true in any way? The Middle East has always been an extremely competitive environment with states that don't know how to work together. It's often the case that they have much stronger relationships with states outside of the region, including trade relations and so on and so forth, than actually to each other. And in this competitive relationship, if you actually take away the constraints that made it possible to have this a period of optimism after the Abraham Accords, that basically to think that now Israel is going to be integrated into a U.S.-managed regional structure in which now we're going to have cooperation and the region can move forward to other directions. That was a period of optimism that was born in certain conditions, which included at the time, of course, the presence of the axis of resistance and the pressure this axis made on the region. But once that is absent, it's not clear why this should continue to be the case, and why shouldn't the region or the various countries in the region that are non-democratic not revert back to more competitive environment?
So then again, you wrote that Arab leaders recognized Israel's capabilities and saw those capabilities as serving their own interests in their own confrontation against Iran. But you said that nevertheless, the Gulf states would intentionally maintain Israel's outsider status to ensure that Israel remains both a partner and a competitor. I want to just ask practically how that works in practice. Like, what does that actually look like on the ground? How do they both manage to integrate Israel to some extent, but also keep it on the outside?
This is actually the current condition as it is, and it has been for quite some time, even before the Abraham Accords. That is, first of all, Israel outperforms many Arab countries. If we're going to talk about a competitive climate, Israel easily outperforms almost all Arab states on the various metrics of competition, whether technological superiority, attractiveness to Western investment and Western companies, even tourism, with the exception of Dubai, perhaps, economy, an actual viable growing economy that's not entirely hydrocarbon based, military dominance, escalation control region-wide. It's just Israel completely dominates this. Now, if you add to this another complicated element that's now with the post-Islamist liberalization project that clearly a lot of Gulf states have been undertaking with their populations, including Saudi Arabia, the rise of an English-speaking, secular, post-Islamist Arab middle class, that also opens another venue of Israel outperforming Arabs, which is basically soft power, appeal to a lot of this new generation of secular Arabs. I don't think this is counterintuitive to anything. I think that's actually very logical. So in this environment, if it's this competitive, it makes much more sense to ensure that you maintain your comparative advantage by maintaining Israel at least out of the formal structure of regional politics through insisting on, I'm not going to normalize with Israel as long as there is no Palestinian state, which is a very comfortable foil since the likelihood of establishing a Palestinian state is very low. So what you get is a situation that we had, as I said, for a very long time, which is we cooperate when we on military intelligence. We eliminate mutual threats together. There are opportunities of trade. We still buy your military equipment and technology. We have direct channels of communications, but we don't actually have formal relations. We can denounce you whenever we want. We join together in the HRC to issue our statements and so on. So here you can maintain this delicate equilibrium between maintaining your own regional competitive edge over the Israelis, ensure that they are alienated from the region and they look like a pariah, at the same time benefiting from the relationship with them as you need.
That's the HRC. That's the Human Rights Council at the United Nations, and I suppose that it maintains. It is still the case that denouncing Israel and standing up for the Palestinians rhetorically serves a very important domestic political function in Saudi Arabia.
Well, yes, but I have to say, even with the recent developments, I was still shocked. That is, what happened in the past few weeks, and their unbelievable pivot in terms of rhetoric domestically and regionally against Israel and the UAE, that part itself I also didn't foresee. When I wrote the essay in June, my expectation was, well, the Saudis now have no reason to normalize, so they are not going to normalize, and the easiest way for them to do this is to insist on a Palestinian state. But that did not entail that all of a sudden they will recall a lot of Muslim Brotherhood figures from abroad, get them back to Saudi Arabia to make statements praising the kingdom, using their online channels to denounce the Zionist Emirati conspiracy of fragmenting and destroying Arab sovereignty, getting closer to Turkey and Qatar. That itself, I definitely was shocked by, and I didn't foresee that they would do that much of a pivot.
So the instrumentalization of anti-Zionism is even more concentrated, more focused, more exaggerated than you thought it might be. We should try to, by the end of our conversation, see if we can puzzle together the logic of why that would be so useful and why it could recur at just this moment. In the piece that you published earlier this week, you actually begin to introduce us to a way of thinking about the structural framework of the Middle East. Let's begin with this idea of post-liberalism, which has to do with the American role in the region. It's not just a kind of retrenchment and what you might think of as an American first isolationist policy. That's not really what we're seeing. We're seeing the end of a kind of rules-based hegemony where, well, explain what that means. We're seeing the end of a kind of rules-based hegemony that, but still allows America to participate in the region on an ad hoc basis.
Right. So post-liberalism, I think the term usually is used in ideological and domestic purposes, but now we're gonna just talk about it in terms of foreign policy. What does that actually mean for regions like the Middle East? First of all, I claim that actually it's no longer an anticipation. It's already the climate in which everybody is acting as it appears in the Middle East. Now, despite the fact that the Middle East was very resistant, historically, Arab states, very resistant to democracy, liberalization, the fact is that you had an American hegemony over the region, and American hegemony globally managed itself through a liberal international structure of institutions. That is, you get leverage by institutionally participating with the United States in the different forums with the regional and international the United States sponsors, and this is how you gain access to markets. You gain cooperation with the United States in security, in economics, and many other things. Now, this is obviously changing. The United States is withdrawing. We have seen what happened starting from USAID to the last week. Secretary Rubio basically announced a withdrawal of a very large amount of these international institutions. And the U.S. foreign policy already has been, since the coming of the Trump administration, been very clearly very transactional. We go make single trade deals with each country now. We're out of this free trade world regime. We're going to go to each one and actually find a deal on their own. So we're becoming selective and we're becoming very transactional. You see this in the Middle East. I want to remind everyone that when President Biden went on his first trip in 2022, in the famous trip in which he had that famous fist bump with the Saudi crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. It was this kind of still of that liberal attempt to maintain that liberal institutional order. That is, you had President Trump there sitting on a round table.
President Biden, yes.
President Biden, sorry. And you had all of the leaders of the GCC countries, plus Jordan and Egypt, present, creating this framework for cooperation regionally under American management. That's not the Trump style. President Trump went to each of the major three Gulf capitals separately, Riyadh, then Abu Dhabi, then Doha, and made separate transactional deals with each of them. This ultimately means a transformation of this structure in the region, in which there is no longer an American order umbrella. I mean, American behavior in the region on transactions and deals and even military engagement is not happening within any sort of a broader conception of the region anymore. It's ad hoc, it's selective, and that opens the room for greater competition between these states for actually establishing a new hierarchy in the region.
So let's put these two different pieces together. There's, on the one hand, what you've just described, the replacement of multilateral thinking with bilateral thinking, where the United States is still actively involved, but makes one-on-one deals in its interest with each nation in the region. Put that together with the military consequences of Israel's engagement with Iran, the end of the Iranian axis of resistance. Those two things create, in your vocabulary, in your term, a dual vacuum that completely reshapes the dynamics of the region. Explain what you mean by that, and explain what consequences both of those vacuums together have.
Right. So what gave the region its structure of cooperation under the American umbrella for the past decade or longer were two things: that active American engagement in coordinating this assemblage of partners and allies that the United States had in the region, which, by the way, included Israel. Maybe they wouldn't meet them together, but usually in the same trip, you go and you meet the Israelis and you meet the Arabs, and ultimately they are both U.S. allies. But from the other hand, you had to have an adversarial force, which was basically the axis of resistance that threatened. First of all, it was a counter-hegemonic project to the American umbrella altogether, and it threatened all of the U.S. allies in the region, the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, and of course Israel. Now, these two conditions together is what gave structure for the region for this past decades, and ultimately created the environment in which the Abraham Accords happened. Now, once you had the complete degradation of the axis of resistance following October 7th, you had degradation of their proxies, complete decapitation of Hezbollah. You had, which in turn induced a regime change in Syria, and you had you have now a Sunni anti-Iranian regime in power, and then ultimately the last summer war against Iran, which humiliated Iran and paralyzed their nuclear program. All of this ultimately means that this condition doesn't exist. And of course, as we said, the American condition doesn't exist. This creates a fluidity in which now basically states have no longer the pressure to work together in the way they did. And this now is exploding, as we see, first in the Saudi-Emirati open rivalry that's breaking in the open. Now, the Saudis and the Emiratis have always had disagreements. They've always had competitions, a lot of it over oil output. The Saudis are very limited on not reaching their capacity because of, the Emiratis, because of the Saudi determined quotas from OPEC. They've always had these, but now we have this opening or this competition breaking out to the open with a Saudi intensification of its own or new instrumentalization of anti-Zionism and even Islamist and old Arabist rhetoric that we haven't seen in a very long time.
Just for people who are not up to date, explain what not the deeper reasons and endemic reasons, but right, the most current reasons, the on the surface reasons for this latest flare up of Saudi Emirati tension.
Well, the main pretext of this was of course Yemen. It's the Emirati backed Yemeni forces. The STC, they moved into Saudi or territories that were dominated primarily by Saudi patronized forces, which then forced the Saudis, or suddenly the Saudis decided actually to conduct airstrikes on these actually Emirati sites. So here we have basically the Saudi military bombing actual Emirati sites, ultimately driving the Emiratis entirely outside of Yemen. Now, this is happening in a much bigger context. First of all, we have the issue of Somaliland, in which also the Saudis became extremely hostile to, pointing it as, again, another Emirati Zionist attempt to fragment the sovereignty of Arab countries. And of course, what's been happening in Syria. And I think what's happening in Syria is very important to talk about, because it really illuminates a big part of this conflict, which turns out to be about basically end states. I mean, what is the final shape that we should expect to take place politically in a lot of these territories?
So,
now,
go on, Hussein.
So in Syria, the Saudis have been very invested in the government of al-Shara since they came to power. Let's remember that they are the ones who actually brought him to Riyadh to have the famous handshake with President Trump, which kind of signals the rehabilitation of Syria. They are the ones who've been lobbying in order for the sanctions to be removed in Syria. They committed, along with the Qataris, to pay the debts of Syria, and they committed a lot of aid and investment packages. There's a lot of reasons for this. They don't want the Turks to have all the influence on their own, is one of them. It's a great buffer against Shias and Iran. They have a lot of investment in Syria becoming a Sunni dominant, even Islamist leading. I mean, by the end of the day, Saudi Arabia, even as they're liberalizing internally, they are very comfortable working with jihadists, former jihadists, Islamists, and so on. Just the history and the relationships are there. So they have a lot of...
Now, Hussein, when you look at the question of Syria from Israel's point of view, I think Israel's strategic calculation is that it serves its purposes for Syria not to be centralized, not to be concentrated in the power concentrated in the regime.
Right.
Israel, I think, feels more secure, having learned this lesson from October 7th, that one cannot trust in the rhetoric and intentions of any given competitor. One has to look in a more focused way at their capacities. And therefore, diminished capacities among competitor states means a more safe Israel. And for that reason, Israel sees its own interests served by Kurdish autonomy and other regional and disaggregated nodes of power in Syria. That would put Israel and Saudi at a conflict of visions as it relates to Syria. How do the Emiratis relate to that?
Well, this actually intersects directly with the Saudi-Emirati rivalry. So what the Saudi have been accusing the Israelis of, it doesn't apply to the Emiratis, but it actually makes more sense if you say the Emiratis. That basically there's a vision for fragmented region. As you exactly said, that's not really the imperative of Israel. The imperative of Israelis is security. If this is achieved through ensuring that no Turkey 2.0 rises in Syria, they will do that. But they are not actively fragmenting. So, for example, I wanted to, and this is an important point, because all of the media and influence campaigns of the Qataris and the Saudis, this is exactly what they have been pushing in these last few weeks, that Israel is pushing for fragmentation of sovereignty and so on. An example would be Lebanon. So in Lebanon, the interest of Israel is a centralized, powerful Lebanese government that disarms Hezbollah, disarms all the militias, takes control, and maintains peace on Israel's
right. Has the monopoly of physical violence. Yes,
that's it. And then that's what Israel wants. Now, obviously, in Syria, the calculation is different because of exactly what you said, the conditions, the presence of Turkey, who is Ahmed al-Shara, what is the background of the current government, and of course already the alarming presence of large numbers of Islamist and jihadist militias and their behavior with the minorities. So that means that the Israeli calculation of Syria is fundamentally different than one in Lebanon, and that clashes, as you said, with what the Saudi wants, and what the Saudi wants. They want it regardless of the cost for Syrian minorities. Let's just, we have to put that there. That is, if you have a discussion with Saudi officials or semi-officials, and you bring up, okay, how about the Druze, or how about this? They wouldn't even answer the question. They will move on about talking about the importance of having a consolidated Syria. It just doesn't really register for them. Now, the Emiratis, in their own form of power that they have accumulated in the region, they have a very different form of power than the Saudis. They don't have the scale of Saudi Arabia, the size of Saudi Arabia, the demography of Saudi Arabia. Their entire power is elite-based. It's based on access to supply chains, controlling logistical corridors, energy flows, investment flows, connectivity, all of this, and so on and so forth. This is how the Emiratis became the regional power that they are. This model privileges access over anything else. So if, let's say, in Yemen, you have the possibility to have this access on all of these investments, regardless of the end state, that is, regardless of there is a centralized state, there is no centralized state, that's what the Emiratis will go for. Because ultimately, they have this vision of, we want investments, we want this access, and we want them now. We're not going to wait. So the Emiratis go ahead and secure pockets of influence in conflict zones. This happened already in Yemen, as we saw. This happens in Libya. This happens in Sudan. This happens so on. So what you get is that the interest or the vision or the overall strategic outlook of the UAE dovetails perfectly with that of Israel. The same thing in Yemen. I mean, as I said, the Emiratis have an interest in just securing pockets of influence in which they can then optimize in their own logistical corridors regionally. The Israeli interest in Yemen is just to secure the Red Sea, is to contain the Houthis and make sure that that the Red Sea access for shipping, for their shipping and international shipping, is secure. There's no arms smuggling, and so on and so forth. So here you have Emirati interest coincides with Israeli interest and leaves out the Saudi interest. That is, now you have this structural asymmetry between what the Saudis want and what the Emiratis and the Israelis want. And then that made the Saudis, or led the Saudis, to conjure up this now basically narrative or image of the region that they are putting, that the Israelis and the Emiratis are working together in a mutual vision in order to fragment Arab sovereignty. And of course, as we said, they instrumentalize anti-Zionist rhetoric and all of this.
Hussein, to go back to this, the way that you're inviting us to look at the region, nation by nation, rather than in the blocks that had been sort of convenient ways to conceptualize something like a Cold War, at times even a hot war, between the Israeli South Gulf bloc and the Iranian bloc. The way that you're now inviting us to see the region means that we should take stock of the comparative advantage of each of the nations and the way that they understand themselves. In the piece that you published earlier this week, you point to a couple of things. Let me just list them and get you to react and explain. There is Saudi Arabia's symbolic authority. You've just talked about this, but there's the Emiratis' networking power in logistical operations. There is the Qatari's narrative control. There is Turkey's coercive capacity, Israel's escalation dominance. Each one of these nations understands itself to have not only a different comparative advantage than the others, but in some ways incompatible comparative advantages. They're competing on different planes. Right. Just explain how you understand this and what our listeners should know.
Well, as you said, it's each of these countries try to maximize. Ultimately, everybody's trying to maximize their power. They're trying to maximize their interest and try to maximize their influence. Remember, this is a structure of a region that is not democratic. That is, these governments are not insecure. I mean, the ones that we're talking about, with the exception of Israel, they are not insecure domestically. I mean, you have ruling families that stay power for a long time. Turkey practically is becoming the same thing. They don't have pressures of liberal democratic regimes to find some foreign policy that is agreeable or that liberates them or based on their domestic policy. So they compete with each other ferociously to maximize their power all the time. Now, each of them, they have comparative advantages that the other players cannot replicate by investment, generally cannot replicate by investment or by any other means. For example, Saudi Arabia's power. It's Saudi Arabia. Well, they have all of the wealth of the oil, but they are the symbolic guardians of Islam. It's the center of Islam. They have the annual pilgrimage, which has a huge power and symbolic power for the Saudis and religious prestige. No one can replicate this. The Emiratis can't replicate this. Qataris can't replicate this. So that's the comparative advantage that they have. And ultimately, when the going gets rough, when the competition gets severe, that's everybody's going to use a comparative advantage that they know to play the best. Now, the Qataris invested in the last 3 decades, as everybody knows, on basically this massive apparatus of narrative control, both in the Middle East, that makes them control the populist and the Islamist narratives often, and now, of course, in Western countries. Massive investments in elite universities, Georgetown, Cornell, the Ivies here, even in London, Oxford, King's College, and of course, all of the media presence that they have. This gives them also an enormous power, not to mention access to Western elites, investments with Western elites, patronizing Western professionals. I mean, these people actually have payrolls in which they pay a lot of people in Western capitals. Turkey have a traditional geopolitical power. It's a NATO state, so on. And Israel doesn't have access to.
It has. One should say, it not only has that political power, it has military power that is of a different order than some of these other nations.
Saudi Arabia cannot compare to Turkey on the military realm. It's a major military state. They have one of the largest militaries in the region and in the world. Now, Israel doesn't have many of these things. They don't have the size. They don't have the scale. They don't have the hydrocarbon wealth. They don't have this huge state or territory or military like Turkey. They don't have the media empire, despite all of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. They don't have the media empire that the Qataris have. They don't have the religious symbolic power that the Saudis have. What the Israelis have is superior technology, military dominance in the region, and complete escalation control. That is, Israel controls confrontations, time, place, intensity, and duration. And this is ultimately what ended up being now the most dominant form of power, especially in these last 2 years. I mean, since October 7th, the rhythm, the capacities, the limitations of a lot of the moves in the region has been actually determined by the kind of the military occurrences of Israel. And I think that then intensifies the competition in which a lot of these actors are trying to use their comparative advantage specifically against Israel in order to check Israeli advantage and raise their own.
So now let's go back to specifically the Saudi pivot, the way that you describe it. Why did Saudi Arabia choose the Palestine issue specifically as its instrument against the UAE?
First of all, I think it's a colossal mistake. I mean, it makes sense if you actually think about it. There is a lot to be gained. It is the most effective populist political tool in the Arab street. It has a very, very strong religious leverage. It works because of just the way that things are. Their interest is colliding with that of Israel in many places. The United Arab Emirates is the leader of the Abraham Accords and now the main Arab friend and ally of Israel. So it's just the conditions, plus I think the dispositions of the Saudi. I mean, you also have to take that into account. Also, you have a leadership style and you have that differs. I mean, you have a lot of inputs and a lot of factors that ultimately goes into the matrix in which a decision maker takes that decision. So we can account for some of these factors, but ultimately they are large. So I think also the disposition of Saudi Arabia helped a lot. And then, of course, you have the coordination itself that now we're going to coordinate with the Qataris and the Turks. The Qatari basically have the largest investment in the Palestinian cause in terms of narrative. And we've seen actually that working in real time in the last 2 or 3 weeks. That is, when Saudi Arabia started its campaign, not just a military campaign, just a campaign against the UAE and Israel in general, just when the pivot happened, you saw a massive activation of this huge and colossal empire of narrative control that the Qataris run in favor of Saudi Arabia, running and this is what you're going to see in most of the media by most of the Middle East experts in a lot of the publications, you'll see that Saudi narrative. I mean, that's a form of power also that has its own seduction. And the Saudis, I think basically calculated that they do have a very large symbolic comparative advantage that is best optimized to use this kind of populist anti-Zionist discourse in the Middle East, pro-Palestine, and a lot of they actually revived some of kind of the Arabist discourse of Arab sovereignty, Arab unity, the Emiratis and the Israelis wants to fragment us and so on.
You know, one has to acknowledge that, of course, there's multiple audiences always for all of these campaigns.
Right.
One of the audiences is clearly a domestic political audience. Another is a regional audience, which is not overlapping but not the same. There is utility, one has to acknowledge, in having international Western audiences echo back and reinforce the messages that come out of this campaign. And in that regard, one has to, I believe, acknowledge that when the Qataris are advancing this Saudi interpretation of events, they're pushing on an open door in the West.
Right.
And there are lots of Americans who, whether or not they're explicitly being incentivized to repeat this kind of narrative, the intellectual climate is such that they are primed to believe it anyway.
I think that's one of the main asymmetries when it comes to narrative control and the issue. I think it's the same problem that Emiratis and Jews have. They share also this issue, which is the intellectual climate internationally. So the most prestigious institutions, whether universities, whether publications, is all at best left-leaning. If not, we all know it also has problems of radical leftism. And that means it's naturally dispossessed to anti-Zionism, distrust Westernization, however it happens, modernization. So anybody who's claiming, post-colonial authenticity as opposed to Americanization and being an ally of the United States or culturally modern also gets points immediately. And now we've seen the massive input of straightforward, unadulterated anti-Semitism, whether on the left or the right, and that are now actually the distinction is blurring at many times. So as you said, the Qataris are not, it's important to remember this, the Qataris did not invent these forms of dispositions and radicalism. They exist, as you said, they just pushed on an open door. They invested in ideas that already people are open to and dispossessed towards. And that puts the Emiratis and the Israelis at a very terrible disadvantage. The Emiratis specifically, their model of legitimacy depends almost entirely on elite legitimacy. That is, they depend on elite opinions. As we said, their power is about logistical control, investment hubs, so on and so forth. The Abraham Accords was a great move as a reputational kind of win in order to get that legitimacy among Jews in Washington, among kind of Western elites who are pro-Israel and pro-Zion or philo-Semitic, and they managed to get that. But that form of elite legitimacy is extremely difficult to convert, whether to street legitimacy, especially in the Middle East, or legitimacy within these cultural institutions that control narratives.
Convert to street legitimacy, it would seem to be the opposite, that the more elite legitimacy something has, the less likely it's going to be embraced by the population.
Which is the populism that Qatar, I mean, it's really, the whole thing is so cynical and hypocritical at times. It's unbelievable that it works. I always feel that I'm sure that the people, the Emir in Doha wakes up every morning besides himself that this is actually working, what they are doing. I mean, by the end of the day, the Qataris are one of the largest investors in elite institutions and elite power themselves, yet they managed to kind of harvest this populist impulse to actually leverage it against the Emiratis and the Israelis.
Hussein, we don't know what is going to happen in the next weeks or days or hours or minutes in Iran. Seems like something of tremendous significance could potentially happen there. Can you just speculate for us a couple of different directions? What consequences a retrenched Iranian regime would have, and what consequences something more fundamentally revolutionary, a post-Islamist Iran might look like? Paint out, both of those scenarios. How would they change the dynamics of the region as you're now inviting us to understand them?
Well, if the Islamic Republic maintains its power, but humbled, weakened by Israel and its own domestic unrest. We don't know how likely the scenario is, but if it happens, I don't foresee much change. Basically, you're still going to have this very competitive environment. What you can have even Arab states, mainly Saudi Arabia, reaching out to Iran, trying to cultivate now Iran as a client, which would be actually a possibility. The Saudis have a lot that they can offer the Iranians. So itself, Iran's going to be the subject of the competition between these powers. Whether to be optimized or be co-opted into one of the alliances or one of the blocks, or to use them against each other. Now, that's one possibility. The other possibility, I think, and one of the very few ways I see the region or an off-ramp for the region of a potentially prolonged period, maybe a decade of this very intense competition between everyone, is that you end up from the current unrest in Iran having a post-Islamist consolidated Iranian regime that is friendly to the West or friendly to Israel, or at least not hostile to Israel. I think that adds a massive new input to this competitive environment that ultimately opens opportunities of alliances that didn't exist there. Maybe they then join a closer to Israel and the UAE, and that transforms really the competitive edge of everybody, because Iran also has its comparative advantages, but now they have been completely shut out of the region because of just the Islamic Republic. They have also massive amount of symbolic power. I mean, it is the main Shia state. They have very long cultural Islamic history. It's kind of the France of the Middle East historically in terms of their elite cultural status. They have a very large population that's very diverse. They have a huge offshore oil reserves, and they have a huge military, big population, so on and so forth. This gives Iran a lot of comparative advantages that then diminishes the comparative advantages of Saudi Arabia and Turkey, for that matter. That might threaten some of the Gulf countries, especially the small ones that always don't like the possibility of a hegemonic large state. But it actually, I think, would control a lot of the competition regionally and provide for a much stable structure regionally.
Okay, so now zooming out, thinking about the framework that you are recommending we have to see beyond in order to understand reality as it really is. Any number of very hopeful fantasies, not to say delusions, were engendered by the prominence of the Abraham Accords, the establishment of the Abraham Accords. You now think that we have to move beyond those fantasies. In that environment, in the environment that you describe and you would have us adopt, what should Israel's strategic posture be?
Well, Israel has to act accordingly. That is, Israel has to cultivate its own comparative advantages. The Israelis do not have an option but to maintain the comparative advantages that they have and even increase it, given the conditions. The technological superiority, AI investment now, and military dominance and escalation control. The Israelis have to clearly maintain and increase these. They have to take into account the kind of the post-liberal international situation that we're in, the uncertainty about U.S. foreign policy. They already are. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced massive investments in Israel's own military industry and reducing dependence on U.S. aid to zero. I think these are actually very good moves. But this has to be done intentionally, knowing that this is the competitive environment and that Israel needs to maintain that competitive edge that they have. I think that's...
By the way, you might think that it's wise for Israel to be so open about the fact that it wants to draw down military aid from the United States. Maybe it's wise, maybe it's not wise. But I want to put that aside, the merit of and substance and content of that decision aside. I still think that one has to acknowledge that whether or not the Israelis receive a penny of aid from the United States, so if it's not this, it'll be something else. Meaning the utility of anti-Zionism will not diminish because policy changes take place in Washington, D.C.
No, this is true. I think actually the utility of anti-Zionism actually will increase in the United States. Maybe we'll talk about this. The second thing I think it's important for the Israelis to recognize. So the Abraham Accords, again, it was a transactional approach from the Trump administration. It matches a lot of The UAE own model of legitimacy, regional power, so on and so forth. There is no going back on that in that term. But the larger fantasy for the region, I think it's gone. The conditions and the situation, the rivalries against Qatar, Saudis, and Turkey, is bringing the UAE and Israel is even closer together. The interests, and this is easy or happening now easily because also it happens to be, and this is important to put in consideration, it happens to be that the interest of the Israelis and the Emiratis is converging in a lot of places. But there will come issues when the interest is not aligned, when Israel may have will have different interests than the Emiratis. We'll see how these things are handled. I don't expect the Emiratis. I don't think they are as impulsive as the Saudis. They'll never do something that the Saudis will never say never in politics. But I think it's safe to assume that they wouldn't do anything that the Saudis that the Saudis just did. However, also there is a possibility that the long-term strong strategic partnership translates also to a deeper affinity. We saw this in the relationship between Israel and the United States. I mean, the relationship between Israel and the United States largely started a lot of strategic consideration, and with time, it developed its own deep bonds and bases. And I think this should be the long-term vision of Israel in its relationship with the UAE right now. We shouldn't delude ourselves. There's a lot of competition. The interests align now. They may not be aligned tomorrow. So we need to take that into consideration, but make it our objective goal long-term to have deeper bonds. The last thing that I think Israel should do, Israel should actually try to act against the assumption of the competitors. That is, if Israel is assumed to be safe because Israel cannot compete for legitimacy regionally, I think maybe perhaps Israelis should actually think about a way to break through that assumption, that actually Israel could break out of this. The world is changing. As we said, there is a new Arab middle class. Israel could directly also address these new public opinion spheres and gain legitimacy there. There are a lot of looking forward young people in the region. We all meet them now, English speaking, very modernized young Arabs, women and men, especially from a lot of these modernizing Gulf country. This is a new constituency that Israel should actually try to invest in reaching out to. So you don't have only complete narrative dominance from the Qataris that lures in the Saudis in this way.
How so? How could they do that? How could they appeal directly to that new constituency you've articulated?
Well, I don't know. I just have the idea. I mean, this is obviously for people to think about how this could be possible. But to think about it, here's the thing: Israelis reach out to other people all the time. They learned how to reach out to evangelical Christian Americans, and they built that for a very long time. They learned how to reach out to Western middle classes, and they've learned that for a very long time. Now, understandably, for a very long time, Israel never really looked eastward because there was not much to look. It's just all of the conditions, not to mention the technology. The technological means of communication wasn't even there. Now, all of this is changing radically. I mean, it's a very different world than it was 10 years ago, not to say 20 years ago. There could be an investment. First of all, everybody speaks English. You don't even need to. There could be an investment in channels that directly address and actually engage with, not just to address them as an audience, but actually engage with that world. I think a lot of this happening organically. So, for example, if you look at I-24, the Israeli English news channel, you'll find actually a large part of the hosts that you get are actually Arabs, English-speaking Arabs, experts, and so on. This has to be done consciously. An investment has to be done in this. This will help Israel break out of that assumption that others are acting on, that Israel is going to be a pariah state. One of the things to contain Israel is to keep it a pariah state for the populations in the Middle East.
Okay, this is your message to Israelis, people thinking about Israeli interests, Israeli decisions. I want to now turn to American Jews explicitly, because what we've already said about the Qatari shaped information environment is that the utility of anti-Zionism, which in all intents and purposes is anti-Semitism, the utility of anti-Jewish ideas will grow more appealing as a political instrument for all kinds of different states and times. But right now the Saudis channeled through Qatari-shaped media. That means, though, that Western audiences and the Western information environment is an active arena of competition. And that implicates American Jews and American Jewish institutions directly. What would you have to say to them?
Everything what you said is true. It's just if you have major, these are not small powers. You're talking about very wealthy Middle Eastern powers with a lot of access in the West, with a lot of leverage, with a lot of finances. If they are having this intense, unstructured, often unstructured now, competition between each other, and a lot of it is happening in Western institutions, there is no reason to assume that they are not going to even utilize more anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism at a moment when things are getting worse in terms of those two ideologies, whether on the right, whether on the left, and so on. It's actually reasonable to assume that likely there will be more investment, that things will get worse. I think first of all, they have to be understood as what they are. I mean, this is now anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the United States are becoming extremely complex. They have a strategic aspect. This is not just some radical student taking the words of a radical professor in a university and just that's creating a problem and Tucker Carlson. No, this is actually, it is that problem, but also there is a major strategic aspect to it, in it for Israel and for foreign policy. This you have foreign powers now actively involved in this. And that means that American Jews will have to continue to fight for themselves and for their safety, because now, and it's very sad to say this, John, our dear listeners, everybody knows this. If we, in 5 minutes, get a notification on the phone about some shooting at some synagogue or of some Jewish event in some Western country, we'll be very shocked and sad, but nobody will be surprised. That is, it became expected that this sort of thing now happens almost on a regular basis.
You know, in that respect, both the condition of the Jewish diaspora in the United States and across the Western world and Israel in the Middle East, both the Jews find themselves back in history in every possible respect. I think the appropriate way to understand this, Hussein, is as a reversion to the normal circumstances of Jewish existence. This is not, what you were saying sounds dark in comparison to the, at times, untethered and unrealistic hopes we had once harbored. But I think instead of looking at it as a period of exceptional darkness or foreboding, that we're standing on the threshold of a period that looks so intimidating. I think the right way to understand this is that we are now back in the normal conditions of Jewish history.
Sadly, that's definitely how it looks like. But I would say that there are also advantages now. There is Israel. There's a strong.
Oh yeah, for sure. Right.
Jews are now, they have managed to accumulate through this last 80 years of liberal success. A lot of knowledge, a lot of technical mastery of a lot of things that needed to survive in this world, a lot of power and a lot of access. So these things, I think, puts Jews at an advantage in order to see these things better and defend themselves. But also we have to remember this, that the same thing is happening also with a lot of Israel's enemy. That's definitely the condition in the Middle East. I mean, also what's happening in the Middle East, we could say that this is also a version of the situation in the Middle East when you had this competition between all of these predatory regimes, in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, in Algeria, Gaddafi, so on. Everybody was funding proxies against everybody else, and so on and so forth. This is true, but a lot of these regimes were extremely incompetent, extremely corrupt, so on and so forth. A lot of the current regimes are much more capable than before. They have AI investments, they have drone industries. Remember that actually the Middle East now is what's supplying Russia itself with military technology, especially drones. So also the competition or Israel, the level in which or the environment in which Israel is acting and American Jews or Jews in general are acting also has much more threats. That also, it's not a message of darkness, but I think it's a very good, realistic understanding of where we are today.
A message of sobriety. Why attacks on Iran will not lead to an Arab embrace of Israel is an essay that Hussein published in Mosaic in June 2025, and the Abrahamic Metacritique earlier this week published the Saudi Pivot. Hussein Aboubakr Mansour, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John. My pleasure.